to the idea of the timeline, and let's talk about some global things that are going on here. We talked about how the northern kingdom was destroyed by Assyria in 721. That's the date for the fall of Samaria. And the 10 northern tribes were taken off into exile. That was the way the Assyrians would control their people they conquered. And the northern 10 tribes basically disappear from the face of the earth. There is a story, a book in the Bible, of Tobit, and that story tells about an Israelite going into exile who maintains his identity as an Israelite. It's a great story. It's extra credit. But by and large, the 10 northern tribes, when they go off into exile into the different parts of Assyria, they assimilate, we assume, with the local populations, and they lose their identity as Israelites. They intermarry, they adopt different practices. And this goes back to the story of Abraham moving from Mesopotamia to Canaan. In the ancient world, when you moved, you would change your religion. You would adopt the religion of the local people. So the fact that the 10 northern tribes effectively disappear isn't really surprising. And the fact that the people brought in by the Assyrians, the people who become known as the Samaritans later, they intermarry with Israelites who remain behind after the exile, and they adopt the worship of Yahweh, which the Jews in the south resent, and that's why we have this Jew-Samaritan conflict in the time of Jesus. But that's the way things operated in the ancient world. When you moved to a new place, you would adopt the local religion. As I said before, the southern kingdom survived the Assyrian conquest, but they were destroyed by the Babylonians in 587. 587 is the worst day in Jewish history. It's the day that Jerusalem, or the year that Jerusalem fell. The palace was burned down. Every large building in Jerusalem was burned to the ground. The temple was plundered, and the temple was burned to the ground. And for Americans, the World Trade Center being bombed on 9/11 was a tragic event, these symbolic towers. But even back then, not that many Americans identified strongly with the World Trade Center. If Disneyland had been bombed on September 11th, I think that would have had a much more emotional impact on most Americans, because so many people travel to Disneyland and visit Disneyland or Disney World. And when the temple is burned to the ground in 587, anybody who was Jewish at the time and lived in Palestine would have visited the temple at least once in their lifetime, probably once or twice a year. And so this symbol of their religion, of Solomon, of Jerusalem, that being burned down was emotionally, thousands of times worse for the Jews of their time than I think the World Trade Center was for many Americans. That's a little tangent. The Babylonians, like the Assyrians, take most of the Jews, or many of the Jews, or at least the elites of the Jewish culture, and send them off into exile. And what happens, and this is the beginning really of the diaspora, the spreading out of the Jewish people beyond the Promised Land, what takes place with the southern tribe of Judah is different, because the Jews in exile maintain their identity as people of God. They maintain their Sabbath observance and their kosher observance and their Torah observance. And when Cyrus of Persia takes over in 538 BC and says, hey, if any of you want to go back to your original homelands, you may, the Jews still have their identity. The people of Judah, the Jews, have maintained their covenant with God. And so in 538, they return and reestablish their culture and their religion. They rebuild the temple and start all over again, or resume things. But that experience of being uprooted from their land and being brought back fundamentally changes Judaism. And if I can use this term, it changes it for the better. Judaism matures during this time. So sharpen your pencil or get your pen out. Here's the big idea. The Babylonian exile, or really the diaspora in general, changes Judaism. Before the exile, if you were a good Jew, how would you worship God? Answer that for yourself out loud or mentally. Hopefully you would say something about a Holocaust, that pre-exilic Judaism, Judaism before they were taken into exile, Judaism before the diaspora, was primarily focused on killing and burning animals or burning different types of grain offerings to God. If you did something wrong, you would offer a Holocaust. If you were thankful for something, you offered a Holocaust. There were daily Holocaust rituals that the priests would perform. The center of Jewish worship was the temple. That's the only place where you were supposed to offer holocausts. You couldn't just do this in your backyard or in your local town. You had to go to Jerusalem and go to the temple and have your sacrifice performed. The people who led these rituals were the priests, the tribe of Levi. They were trained. It was an inherited position, and they knew how to properly kill the animal and collect the blood and which organs were thrown away and which organs were offered. And then the meat from the sacrifices was usually divvied up between the priestly families. So Judaism before the exile was focused on that kind of worship. Judaism before the exile, and I'm going to explain this a little bit more later, was monolatry. The Jews worshipped Yahweh. Yahweh was their God. There's pretty good evidence, even from the Ten Commandments, that the ancient Israelites believed that there were many gods and that Yahweh was their God. And the Jews believed that their God loved them and protected them, and that their God did not like other people, and that their God was not the God of other people. So there was this theological nationalism. We hear about nationalism in the news today. You know, in France, there's a nationalistic candidate for prime minister, and there are certain nationalistic tendencies among groups in the United States. But when we talk about theology, there are people who believe that God only loves their people. God only loves Christians, or God only loves Muslims. The people who bombed the World Trade Center believed that God loved them as followers of Islam and hated the people of the United States who were not Muslim, who were Christian, although there were Muslims who died in 9/11. There were Catholics who had no problem bombing Protestant Christians in Northern Ireland. They believed that God loved Catholics and God did not love the Protestants. There were Serbian Christians, Orthodox Christians, who killed Catholic Croat Christians in the former Yugoslavia in the name of God, or Muslims killing Jews, or Jews killing Muslims, or Sikhs being persecuted by Hindus in India, or even Buddhists killing non-Buddhists in Sri Lanka or Tamil. This idea that God only loves us, that God is our God and only belongs to us. So, and pre-exilic Judaism also believed that God acted within history, that God rewarded the good things we did in time, in the temporal realm. So if you were good, God made you rich. If you were not good, then you were poor. If you were good, you lived a long life. If you were not good, then you got sick and died. If the Israelites were faithful to God, they triumphed over their enemies. If the Israelites were not faithful to God, then they were conquered by their enemies. So God's justice is carried out in the temporal realm, in space and time, in history. And when the Jews go into exile, these things all change. Since they don't have a temple to worship in, they focus on following the kosher laws. They focus on following the Torah. They follow the Sabbath. Because they can't go to a temple to worship, because the temple's been destroyed, the gathering place for Jews changes to synagogues, where instead of offering holocausts, you would gather with other Jews and you would chant the Psalms and you would listen to the readings from the scriptures. and you would pray without sacrificing animals and without burning grain offerings. And the new type of religious leader who emerges in post-exilic Judaism is the scribe. Somebody who's not been trained how to cut up and burn animals, but somebody who's been trained how to read and write, usually for administrative or government purposes, but somebody who can read the Torah, who can read the law and interpret it for people. And so your family origin or your ability to cut up animals isn't important. Your intelligence and your ability to read and write is important. And as the Jews move into exile and stay faithful to the covenant, as they are carried hundreds of miles away from their homeland, they carry with them the idea that God is with them in exile, that God doesn't just live in Jerusalem or live in Palestine, but God lives everywhere, which then leads to the idea that if God lives everywhere, then maybe our God is the only God. Not just that God is our God, but our God is the only God. And the other gods and goddesses that people worship aren't really gods at all. They're false. So because of the exile, Judaism actually becomes fully monotheistic. They believe that there is only one God, versus monolatry, where you worship only one God. The earliest monotheistic statement in the Bible, clearly monotheistic, comes from 2nd Isaiah and comes from the exile. And once you allow for the fact that your God is the only God, then holding on to this idea that God only loves your people or only loves people of your skin color or nationality or religion, then it opens up the possibility that you realize that God maybe loves those other people. God loves those people of other countries or other religions. And that God's relationship is with the whole human race and not just your people. Your people might have a special relationship with God, but God loves other people too. And there are still people today, there are Christians and Jews and Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs who still have this idea that God only loves their group, but I think that a mature Christian faith recognizes that God loves everybody. God doesn't just love our people. There's one God, and that God loves all people. And then the other shift that Judaism makes during this time is to understand that maybe God's justice doesn't take place in space and time. God's judgment doesn't take place in history. The Jews in exile feel that they've been faithful to the covenant, they're God's chosen people, and it doesn't seem fair that they're in exile. Or you might know somebody who is a really, really good person, but who is poor, or somebody who's suffering from a horrible disease, and they're a really good person. Or you know somebody who's rich and who's a horrible person. And so the idea of God's judgment coming at the end of time, that's what the root eschaton means, that maybe it won't be until the end of time that God brings about justice and God punishes the evil and rewards the good. So Judaism makes a shift in their understanding not just of who God is, but also who God loves and how God's justice is meted out. So I don't know why it didn't appear, but the word post-exilic Judaism should appear here, that after the exile, Judaism shifts. And very briefly, I'm going to show this pole that was carved about 850 BCE. And this is from one of the neighbors of Israel talking about how Chemosh, their god, was angry with his land and allowed them to be conquered by their enemies. And then Chemosh came and helped them conquer the city of David. This is the first mention of David outside the Bible. My God loves us and hates other people.